Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Curatorial Roundtable. I'm Steven Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice program at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And for the roundtable each week, I invite a distinguished curator or institutional director to speak about their practice. And today we have Simon Kelly with us from the St. Louis Museum of Art. And I was saying to Simon that it's quite unusual. In fact, I think Simon is the first not contemporary or purely contemporary art curator, though Simon does curate contemporary art also. So I'm really excited to just have a different mindset, different set of concerns expressed. I'm going to read a short bio for Simon. Simon will speak for approximately 50 minutes in his presentation. Then the last 10 minutes is for you to ask questions, and you can do that at the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So, Simon Kelly recently curated the exhibition Currents 125, Blas Sassi, and will debut Women Impressionists in the Land in October. Other major exhibitions include Matisse and the Sea and Monet Mitchell, Painting the French Landscape. Kelly's published extensively on 19th and early 20th century French art, including his book Théodore Rousseau and the Rise of the Modern Art Market. Additionally, he's published essays in the exhibition catalogues, Reckoning with Millet's Man with a Hoe, Millet and Modern Art from Van Gogh to Dalí, Monet, The Late Years, Inspiration Matisse, Inventing Impressionism, Paul Durand-Ruel, and the Modern Art Market, and Becoming Van Gogh. In recent years, he's also written on American Abstract Expressionism, including essays in Monet Mitchell and Robert Motherwell, Pure Painting, and about contemporary African American artists, including Kehinde Wiley and Oliver Lee Jackson. Simon worked previously at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. He received his doctorate from Oxford, where he also taught art history. And as you can see from the screen, Simon will talk today about Millet and Modern Art and another exhibition, which I've already mentioned, Monet Mitchell. So with that, Simon, welcome.
All right. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you for the invitation and great to be here. Stephen actually asked me if I would say a little bit about how I became a curator. Yeah, I mean, as Stephen mentioned, I was in Oxford. I was actually teaching at the Ruskin School of Drawing and Fine Art. I was teaching fine art students in a contemporary art environment, which has stayed with me, even though most of the shows I've done have been more historic. And yeah, I was certainly thinking I would probably pursue an academic path, academic, i.e., lecturer position, or maybe at Oxford or whatever. But then I got this postdoctoral fellowship offer at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and that was I decided that was kind of too good an offer to refuse. So I took that. I left Oxford thinking that I would just be in New York for a year and coming back to Oxford. But then I actually loved the museum environment and sort of being able to ground my research in the objects, which you can do if you work within a museum. So that was kind of, I would say, the turning point in my deciding to pursue a curatorial path. But I've continued to, as Stephen mentioned, I've published academic books and continue to publish in academic journals and teach over at Washington University here. So I've sort of straddled the curatorial and academic field, but it's been important to me to be close to the objects within a museum. As Stephen said, I'm going to talk about a couple of exhibitions, and I think a number of my projects, because I try to kind of, there's a sort of dialogue, I would say, between my interest in contemporary art and historic art, and often the kind of themes I'm dealing with, like ecology and precarity and materiality, those kind of overlap in terms of the exhibitions that I'm doing, whether they be contemporary or historic. And I think they actually overlap, hopefully in quite a kind of fruitful way. At least that's what I've kind of found. So, I mean, organizing a historic show is obviously very different to working with contemporary artists. So the two shows I'm going to talk about are, very complicated loan exhibitions, lending, well, particularly the first exhibition, lending from, borrowing rather from lenders all around the globe. This was probably the most ambitious show I've done. And you can imagine the insurance values for the Van Goghs in particular are astronomical. Several of the shows I've done also have been partnerships. That's something that has been important to me as a curator, to think about developing partnerships with other museums, and that's important for our museum, I think, to build those institutional partnerships. And those partnerships generally come out of, I've found, just out of friendships that I develop with curators, and then the larger institutional partnership comes out of that. So this was a partnership that I developed with a friend of mine, Maite van Dijk, who's now the director of the Moore Museum in the Netherlands. But I'd known Maite for several years, and we talked about developing this project, obviously because Van Gogh was so interested in Millet, Jean-François Millet, and he thought that Van Gogh or Millet was the most important modern artist, essentially. I would say conceptually, this exhibition also came out of a conversation with Vivian Green, who's the curator at the Guggenheim. We organized a session at the College Art Association in 2010 called Modernizing Millet. So this show did come out of that academic framework. So you can see the dates there, obviously opening at the Van Gogh Museum. The show in St. Louis was kind of torpedoed a bit by COVID, so that obviously affected things in terms of attendance, but we did extend the show to kind of respond to COVID. So yeah, what I'm going to do is just go through, show you a range of the slides in this exhibition. This was the entrance. So the majority of the shows I've done in St. Louis have been in a building which was designed by the British architect David Chipperfield, has these very distinctive concrete coffers you can see at the top here, and which opened in 2013, 3 years after I came to the museum. Really, one of the main reasons I came to St. Louis was because David Chipperfield, I knew him through Andy Goldsworthy, who we were doing a project, a massive installation that Andy was doing for St. Louis. And the opportunity to work in this building was really an important one to me. So yeah, this is the entrance. Often we do these blow-ups. As you can see, this is details of the Angelus, which is probably Millet's most well-known painting. So at the beginning, I really wanted to bring Millet to life, because for a lot of people, he's not well-known. Probably a lot of people on this Zoom call aren't familiar with him, but in the 19th century, he was one of the most well-known modern artists. And I wanted to, think about his connections to the land. I mean, he worked at Barbizon, which is a small village to the southeast of Paris. He was really the center of a colony of artists there, and artists from all around the world came to Barbizon, often to work with Millet, and that sort of model of the artistic community. That's something that's actually informing the current book I'm working on, called The Barbizon Painters, an Ecological Community, 1830 to 1900. So I'm working on that with Bloomsbury at the moment. But that also, of course, relates to this exhibition. so yeah, Millet was very interested in his kind of self-fashioning, the way he presented himself, even to the extent here of you can see the wooden clogs that he's wearing, the wooden stick that he's fashioned. And one of his friends said that he looked like a peasant leader about to be shot in this photograph, which actually was a characterization which he found quite flattering. Probably not the shooting part, but the connection with the peasantry around Barbizon, which was always something that was important to him, although complicated. So at the beginning of this exhibition, it was kind of, just to make the point about Millet's importance as an artist before we started to talk about the range of other artists who responded to him. So we had this wall at the start, which showed the range of Millet's work. The painting in the middle is not well known, but it came from Japan, a Japanese collection. These paintings, the one at the top right came from the Musée d'Orsay, was one of the first paintings by Millet to enter the French public collection. And then probably for our general audiences, the connection to Van Gogh was the most important, and we had some really strong Van Goghs in the exhibition. We looked a lot at themes of labor, of rural labor, of Millet's interest in precarity, the ways in which he was dealing with a sort of rural laboring class whose position was in many ways threatened by sort of modernizing agriculture or agricultural methods, and his work was really taking place within that wider context. So this was the first gallery. We can see Millet's work on the right, and then a couple of Van Gogh's paintings just behind. This is obviously the Millet on the left, but then again, just thinking about how sort of the way that Millet was seen in the 19th century was important to this show. And this is a caricature that I included, which shows Millet actually painting not with brushes, but with a spade and with a pickaxe and with a hoe. And that's sort of connected to the idea that the paint which he used was compared by critics like Théophile Gautier to the earth. His paint work was often very rough, anti-academic. That was part of his subversiveness in his formal quality. And that's something that's referenced in the caricature. I'll say in general, the sort of idea of this show was to get away from a kind of Greenbergian narrative of the rise of modern art as originating in the work of Edouard Manet and moving from kind of three-dimensional naturalism towards a more kind of two-dimensional flat abstraction, sort of culminating in Jackson Pollock. That's often the sort of standard kind of narrative that we've read. I'm really thinking about Millet as an originating point for another kind of narrative, which is more anti-urban, more ecological. In many ways, you could argue more material, but with a narrative that connects to artists like Cézanne, Morazon Becker. You'll see Goncharova, Homer in the States, Salvador Dali. So a different kind of narrative. That was probably the overarching idea of the show. Here's a Van Gogh that responds to Millet. You can see the sort of coloristic contrast, the way that the Van Gogh is taking Millet's color to another level here. But again, the fascination with the earth, that connection to the land, you can see in this picture also. One of the other themes I'm interested in is the way in which part of, and I use the term avant-garde as well, which is obviously a complicated one, but I see that in Millet's work a kind of tradition of the alignment of the formal and the political, that kind of avant-garde tradition in Millet's work. So that's also something I talked about in the exhibition catalogue, this is the catalogue actually, if you're interested. It was published by Yale. But something else I was also interested in, which connects to this kind of narrative is the turn or the interest in non-Western cultures as a kind of driving force to the experiment for Millet and other artists. So Japanese prints was actually incredibly important for a number of these artists, and also which is probably less well known, but their interest in Native American culture, indigeneity in the US, which was something that the Millet was actually pretty interested in. This is a painting which we got from the Yamanashi Museum. So complicated loan coming from Japan. Again, the gleaners. This relates to that theme of precarity. It was interesting. I mean, again, there's connections to the contemporary. A lot of the themes here you could argue connect to the art of pauvre movements. Yanis Kounelis was a big fan of Millet. There was a performance piece at the Barnes Foundation in 2019 called Glean, which kind of connected to issues of race and blackness and marginalization, but connecting contemporary blackness to the position of the 19th century French peasant. So that performance piece was called Glean. It was by Sherman Fleming, if you're interested in looking it up. So yes, precarity. This was painted at a time when even the actual ability to glean, which was essentially picking up the wheat that had been left over after the harvest, just the kind of the stalks, years of wheat which just had not been collected, was something that was reserved for the poorest people around Barbizon. This activity was threatened. Landowners were starting to charge for the right to glean. So again, Millet here tapping into that theme of precarity and contrasting the workers in the foreground with the kind of plenty of what you see in the harvest in the background. This is me and Maita. I just showed this because here we are in Japan. So most of the shows I try to do, just try to give some insight into the practicalities here of being a curator, is that, this it's not always possible, but as much as possible, I try to see works in advance that we're requesting for exhibitions. So, traveling to private collections. Obviously, because I'm English, I do, even though I'm based in St. Louis, I do come to Europe pretty frequently. So, seeing works from European collections, that process is important to generating an exhibition. And this show, took 5 years plus really to develop. So the timeline for my historic shows, I would say, tends to be more expanded generally than the contemporary projects. And this was so the kind of international range, thinking about Millet in a more global context was again important to this exhibition. So Morbelli is an Italian artist who we had in the exhibition. Again, this is that theme of precarity and the wider historical context, because the theme of hand spinning was again sort of threatened by mechanization, but Millet really kind of focuses on that. So even though you could argue that in some ways his choice of subject matter is quite conservative, the way in which he treated it was actually seen as pretty radical by critics at the time. Actually, often for formal reasons, they saw a kind of proto-abstract flatness to his work, which you can even see in this painting on the left, I think, in the sort of flat blocks of color. You have to contrast that with a much more kind of photographic naturalism of academic painters of peasant life at the time. Liebermann was a German artist who actually lived in Barbizon and was deeply influenced by Millet's work. Homer, so again, thinking about issues of race and blackness and how Millet's work can connect to that. So Homer is painting these. So the second theme of the exhibition was actually rest. So these African-American soldiers here are dialoguing in their gestures and pose with a print by Millet. This is a quote by Van Gogh, which kind of sort of sums up the importance to Van Gogh of Millet, and is something that you could arguably connect to other artists in the exhibition, the importance they ascribed to Millet's work. Van Gogh did several copies after Millet at the end of his life when he was in Saint-Rémy. This is one of them. We had a group of these in the exhibition borrowed from the Van Gogh Museum. This was a major loan for us in St. Louis to get Starry Night from the Musée d'Orsay. That and the MoMA painting. Van Gogh did two of them, arguably Van Gogh's best known works. So that work dialogued with a Millet painting of Starry Night. You can see even in thinking about those connections to the land and in this case there's a kind of astronomical connection as well, because Van Gogh's treatment of the stars, he's actually you can see the Big Dipper there in the top of that painting. And Millet's work, he read astronomical journals, and there are the sky is actually studied pretty carefully here. Another dialogue. Drawings, Millet was inarguably his drawings, which I think are very beautiful and very, very modern. Modern, I think, in that kind of proto-abstract quality. So this is actually a religious subject, the flight into Egypt. He's using crayon here. So one of the things I was kind of interested in his work in terms of his materials was the fact that often his drawings are charcoal. And that's interesting because charcoal is burnt wood. So he's actually using material which is coming from the wood of the forest which surrounded him at Barbizon, the forest of Fontainebleau. So thinking about how he might use a material to actually develop further that connection to the land was something that was important to me. And you see that also in his use of materials in terms of his supports. So he would also use oak panels, an oak which was actually extracted from the forest. So that also starts to connect to issues of extraction, which obviously everyone talks about now as sort of buzzword. And that's been actually an important theme in terms of my exhibition with Blas Isasi. But it's also a theme that you can treat historically in the 19th century, of course, and the way in which Millet is also using, so to complicate it, he's also using wood which is extracted from the forest, has been is wood from cut down trees. So Seurat was another artist deeply impacted by Millet's work. So here are a couple of drawings by Seurat. It's interesting, thinking about Millet's contemporary resonance. I was in London recently. There's a big Van Gogh Kiefer show, and Anselm Kiefer is somebody who dialogues very powerfully with Van Gogh's work. But we just had a big Kiefer show in St. Louis. I was thinking, it actually made me think about, and I don't know this, if Kiefer really was thinking much about Millet, because the connections also seem like you could take them back further beyond Van Gogh. And then, often it's good to anchor your exhibitions to some extent in works in your own collection. I would say that often helps strategically. So Pizarro was another important figure in the show, and the painting in the middle is from the Millet painting is from the St. Louis collection, and the Pizarros are dialoguing with that. We had a section on landscape. The painting in the middle was borrowed from the Musée d'Orsay, and then there's a painting by Innis on the right, a Dutch painter called Roelofs on the left. If you look carefully, you can see there are all rainbows in this painting. There's that kind of interest in the sort of the capturing of time, a sort of brief moment, was important to Millet as a kind of contrast to his interest in deeper time in the forest, the kind of ancient oak trees. But here you're seeing the focus on the capturing of the rainbows. There's also there's a kind of gesturing here to the rural economy. There are all these kind of fruit trees, fruit orchards around Barbizon. So that kind of rural economy, that's also been important to me in the book I'm working on at the moment. Here are those pictures. this one I put in because Millet traveled a lot around France, but also this work formally speaks to his interest in Japanese prints. So again, connecting to that sort of more global interest in his motifs. I don't know. So yeah, I think actually it is worth showing this because when a lot of these shows I've done, I've tried to travel to the places where the artist painted and try to really and it's helped me because you sort of in a way you identify with the artist on a more visceral level. So I went to Millet's birthplace in Normandy and I sort of trekked. I did this like 40-mile trek along the cliffs all around where Millet had painted and I did the same in the forest of Fontainebleau and it did make the it helps because you have all the the thinking of course, but to actually identify with the landscapes viscerally was important to me. Haystacks, that's an important part of the rural economy. The collecting of the hay, the almost kind of like this rural architecture is something that is a really interesting motif and continues in the work of other artists like Monet. And then the Angelus was this important painting, arguably the most well-known painting in the 19th century. It got the record price for a modern painting when it was sold at auction in 1889. Again, it's probably not so well known now, but it was in the 19th century. It's if you go, it's interesting if you go to the Musée d'Orsay, this painting still has a real resonance, particularly with Japan. Millet's work is still very big in Japan, but it was a big loan for us for this to come to St. Louis, and you can see it here with a lot of people surrounding it. And then in this gallery, I put a kind of range of artists who were responding to the work. Morozov Becker was in here, Goncharova, Edvard Munch, actually. This is a Russian artist, Goncharova. And then Dalí, a kind of interesting figure because he was obsessed by Millet's work. Did a whole series of paintings responding to the Angelus and went to Millet's birthplace, as you can see on the right here, and put down flowers in front of his Millet's statue. But his interpretations are, of course, very different. He had this he wrote a book about the Angelus actually, and talked about it in a kind of more kind of psychosexual way. He compared the figures. He compared the woman to a praying mantis, actually, who was actually going to devour her mate, the male in the sexual act, and that kind of context is a background to the paintings he produced. So we had these two in the show. We had a number of others actually by Dalí. So we finished the show with Dalí. We could have continued it further, but decided to keep it focused on the I guess on the more modern period rather than moving into the more postmodern era. And then this was the other show I'll talk about a little bit. So this was a very different kind of exhibition. It was really the product of a collaboration with the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris and the Marmottan Museum, the Musée Marmottan Monet in Paris. So I don't know if any of you saw it. In 2022, there was a big exhibition at the Louis Vuitton Foundation, which kind of connected to the Joan Mitchell retrospective, which traveled around the US, I think to Baltimore and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. But that show in Paris was all about the kind of dialogue between Joan Mitchell, this amazing American abstract expressionist painter, and Claude Monet, arguably the leading French Impressionist painter and a landscape painter. And it was about that, how that dialogue worked and the complexities of it. So in St. Louis, we have a painting called Monet's Water Lilies, which is a central panel of a triptych. And in Paris, they wanted to reunite the triptych. Our painting was really key, and we don't normally lend it. But after protracted discussions, we did agree to lend it. And then really sort of coming out of that, because I wrote a couple of essays for the catalogue in Paris, and I've written Monet quite extensively in the past. we started to talk about the possibility of a more extensive collaboration, and that's what happened. So we ended up borrowing. I mean, it was a reciprocal, really, but it worked in our favor. We borrowed, I think, 10 Mitchell paintings from the Louis Vuitton Foundation. They have an amazing collection of Mitchells. And then about 10 paintings from the Musée Marmottan Monet. So they became the core group in this exhibition that we did in St. Louis. So it was a kind of tighter show in St. Louis. In Paris, it really kind of sprawled. It's such a massive space, Frank Gehry building. And a very different building. Frank Gehry is a very different architect to David Chipperfield. So yeah, we had a smaller number of works in St. Louis, but I think arguably the connections were actually tighter in the exhibition here. So this was the entrance to the exhibition, and I wanted to bring the artist to life. So in a number of the exhibitions I've done, there is this. I guess there is this focus on the land and the landscape and the ecological. So you can see that in this work, in these photographs too, with Monet by his water lily pond, actually looking very dandyish. He imported these suits from Savile Row in London. He had kind of frilly cotton shirts, and you can see the frilliness on his sleeves, which is kind of interesting. The way he presented himself. So that theme of artistic self-fashioning is something that's also probably been part of I'm thinking about that now actually with the women impressionists and the land show I'm doing. And then Mitchell, Joan Mitchell, she obviously she grew up in, well, not obviously, but she grew up in Chicago, grew up in an urban context, was working in the 1950s in New York, very much a central figure within the abstract expressionist circle at that time. Probably she, Grace Hartigan and Helen Frankenthaler were the sort of leading women in that group, and their shows were reviewed as extensively as those of the men, and it's the kind of attention that they're getting now is really overdue. But it's been great to see, particularly Mitchell, be the subject of a number of shows in recent years, and obviously we were connecting to that. But Joan Mitchell moved to Verneuil, which is a town where Monet had also lived. That became complicated for Mitchell, but she moved there in 1968, and she spent the rest of her life there. So she lived the last 25 years of her life in France, and here she is on her veranda with the River Seine behind her. Oh, and so again, that kind of idea of going to the location. So that's something I did. I went to Verneuil, and here I am standing outside Monet's house. So it's interesting that Mitchell bought a house which actually directly overlooked the house that Monet had lived in when he was in Verneuil. So Monet lived in Verneuil for 4 years, from 1878, or 3 years, from 1878 until 1881. So here she's kind of looming over Monet, but I think she also felt that the sort of ghost of Monet was present in Verneuil when she was painting there, and I think that did complicate the sort of dialogue that she had with Monet. So yeah, this is a opening gallery. There's a painting from the Marmottan on the left. The one on the right is Tilleuil or Linden. So one of the things that's always interested me in Mitchell's work is, she's seen as being an abstract expressionist, an abstract painter, but nature is always, and her connections to the land are always really at the center of her work. So really thinking about that kind of complexity that you can always see the land within her paintings, and this you can see quite clearly the kind of rising form of the linden tree. And there was actually a linden tree on her property, and this is it. So this is the work that actually inspired that painting. And then let's see. So yeah, we had these works from Giverny. So thinking about Monet's connection to his landscape, and thinking about Monet as a gardener. He was he actually had 6 gardeners who worked for him, but he was somebody who was very connected to the land, and thinking about buying and cultivating new kind of hybrid breeds of water lilies that had just been developed. He worked with this breeder in Bordeaux called Latour Marliac. So that thinking about Monet as a gardener was also important, and then Mitchell was a gardener too. So she had this large garden at Verneuil, and she grew a whole range of flowers and vegetables in that garden. But one of the flowers that she was particularly attached to was sunflowers. And they grew high, several feet high in her garden. And the painting on the right is called Two Sunflowers. So it's a diptych by Mitchell. It made a kind of really interesting dialogue actually with the works on the right. The coloristic palette is often quite similar, the yellows and the mauves, the greens. But even in the work on the right, you can see when I see that, I look at the oranges and the yellows kind of suggest dying sunflowers. The greens is the grass of her land. The mauves is the kind of evening twilight. The black is the black of the earth of her garden at Verneuil. Couple of images of the gardens. And then, so the painting that was kind of the genesis in many ways of this collaboration with the Louis Vuitton Foundation and the Marmoton's work on the right, the large water lilies. The painting on the left is this amazing triptych. Both of these artists are working in multi-panel paintings, so that's another thing that connects them. That whole important tradition, obviously going back to the Renaissance and beyond, actually, of the polyptych as a sort of key force within the narrative of sort of artistic progression. So Mitchell's work on the right is called Ploughed Field. It's almost as if you see the fields around Verneuil from above, this kind of patchwork of fields. In Mitchell's brushwork, for those who are familiar, there is a difference in the way that they approach paint application, of course. So the use of sort of dripping and paint spatter is something that you don't really find in Monet's work, and that's something that was. Mitchell was very interested in Pollock, for example, that does kind of differentiate them, and that Mitchell kind of in some ways developed Monet's work in that sense. Oh, okay. So again, all of these works by Mitchell, I think you can in some ways connect to the land. So this is a view of the fields, what would become the ploughed fields around Verneuil. We had this large 4-panel painting called Minnesota. The title there was a kind of nod to a friend of Mitchell's who lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And even though her works, Monet was a plein air painter essentially, although memory did become more important for him later on. But Mitchell was not. She did not paint outdoors. She painted in her studio, and her works were works of memory. So that is a difference between them again. But it doesn't undermine the sort of strength of her connection to the land. But this painting on the left, again, it's a memory of America because of Minnesota, but the kind of the colors, the interest in sunflowers, of rapeseed, she talked about that, respond to the colors that she was seeing around her at Verneuil. And then we had the decorative paintings by Monet on the right here. These were actually originally thought of as a kind of a decorative frieze. That's for any of you who've been to the Orangerie and see Monet's installation there, which is a fascinating sort of site-specific installation, still important, I think, for a lot of contemporary artists. Originally, Monet had planned that to be in a different space, which was higher, and for there to be a decorative frieze on top of the water lily paintings, which would have been these works here, the wisteria. Here they are. And then again, thinking about that kind of self-fashioning, the way that the artists were both gardeners and identified with the flowers in their gardens. Monet's late work starts to get very abstract. That's why the abstract expressionists in the 1950s became so interested in his work. So you can see Monet's painting on the right in dialogue with a work by Mitchell on the left. Gallery shot. Late painting by Monet of Japanese Bridge. So not only is it getting abstract in terms of the composition, you can just about make out the Japanese Bridge, but also the color is completely non-naturalistic here. And that may connect in some ways to Millet's problems with cataracts. But it's something again that was seen by that kind of vogue for Monet's work in the 1950s, connected that to that experiment with color that he was doing. And then these are so the painting on the right is called River by Mitchell. This is a kind of nice dialogue. The one on the left by Monet is that kind of interesting. I mean, it's a view of the water lilies pond at Giverny, but it kind of speaks to the abstraction of this work, that it's been hung this way around, but it's also been hung upside down. We don't know which way it should strictly be. It's been hung both ways. So it kind of, and I read it this way. That's how we hung it in the exhibition. There's a bank at the top left, and those are reflections of weeping willows at the bottom. But you can also switch it around, and those could be hanging weeping willow branches. So that just having that complexity around this work spoke to the maybe the sort of forward-looking nature of Monet's work. And then the painting on the right is also a painting of water. You can see the river. So this is probably painted from above. That photograph I showed you of Mitchell, this could be looking down onto the Seine with the yellow marks there. I think those are supposed to reference the Seine River. And then this is south. So, Mitchell, Monet was somebody deeply important to her, but she looked to other artists too, like Cézanne. So this is and she loved Cézanne's work, and just as she did Van Gogh, who she called Vinny. And this work is a kind of dialogue with Cézanne's late paintings of the Mont Saint-Victoire, which you can probably see the kind of mountain forms in the two panels. And it's called South. Mitchell spent time in the south of France, close to where Cézanne had lived and worked. And this was the final gallery. And the work on the left is called EC, and that's actually in the St. Louis Art Museum collection. So this is actually a very poignant work for me because it has so much energy and vibrancy, and even the coloristic palette. She was going in the palette was starting to get a bit more accurate. The oranges, the greens, a little bit different to some of the earlier work, but she was still, pushing boundaries, even when she knew she was dying. She had, cancer when she painted this work. But you can still, even with the changes in the palette, you can still see the connections to nature. And here, for example, this is actually you see that's actually a sunflower. These are sunflower bulbs, and she'd done a whole series of sunflowers just before she painted this work. And the blues and the greens connect to the land, the garden around her. So yeah, this was a great show for us to do, I think, in St. Louis. And in some ways, it was interesting to see the kind of rivalry between the two. And in some ways, I mean, the scale of Mitchell's work is obviously much grander, but I don't know. I mean, a lot of people came to the show because of Monet, obviously, because of his name recognition. But in some ways, Mitchell, I came out of the show almost having a greater admiration for Mitchell. I probably shouldn't say that, actually, being a lot of Monet, but it was kind of amazing to see the number, the sort of power of her work in this show. I just put this one in at the end because this is a recent show I did, and I was just reading a review a couple of days ago about the big Matisse show that just opened in Paris, which I encourage you to go to see. It's a late exhibition on Matisse's cutouts. It's at the Grand Palais. It's organized by Claudine Gramont at the Pompidou, which, as you know, is closed. But yeah, we did a show in St. Louis a couple of years ago, and we had a section in that show of the paper cutouts, and so I just wanted to show this because there is a bit of overlap. I mean, that's a much more ambitious show, but we in St. Louis we I would say we've managed to get for the exhibitions I've done, we've managed generally to get really strong loans, and this show too, the connection to the natural world is obviously here, and the sea, the marine animals in the cutouts on the left, and then the blue nudes. You can see the work on the left, where Matisse originally called those bathers. So those were connecting, and he was a bather himself. There's an autobiographical element to this. So the one on the left came from the large painting on the left came from the Byler Foundation. We worked closely with them on this show. We lent our Matisse bathers painting to them, and then in return they lent us these amazing cutouts, including the blue nude one which you can see on the right, and that's rarely lent. So that was kind of a privilege to have that work in St. Louis. But here in these late works, the kind of ultramarine blue of the sea kind of enters within the bodies of these figures. So I think, Stephen, that's probably where I'll leave it.
Great.
About the time. So I'd be happy to. So you can see there are kind of strands, and kind of continuing within the show I'm doing at the moment, Women Impressionists and the Land, which in some ways you could argue thematically is a kind of pendant exhibition to the Matisse and the Sea one.
Okay, so thanks so much, Simon. There are a couple of questions, so I'll read them. Michael Hill asks, what are the important steps in obtaining loans of major artwork? So a very practical question.
Yeah, I mean, it depends really on the artworks, but I would say, as I do try to go and see the works in person as much as I can. Then there'd be conversations with the curators, the curator of who oversees the work that we're trying to borrow, or a private collector if we're trying to borrow from a private collection. Sometimes if it's a private collection, if I don't know where that collection is, I'll work with, I would say probably most often with auction houses. You have various connections there, and they can help to connect with a private collector, either to go and see the work or to make a loan request. So yeah, depending on where the work is, and then generally I would say it's kind of informal discussions, and if I get a good sense that the work will be lent, and then we'll formalize it, and there'll be an official loan request that's sent from our director, Min Jung Kim, at the St. Louis Art Museum, or if it's a partnership, it'd be a joint letter sent by our director and the director of the partner museum, and then essentially we wait, and then just the amount of time you have to wait to get a decision depends on, sometimes it can be immediate if it's a private collection, but if it's a museum, obviously there's more kind of steps to go through. For us here, and like other museums, there's a collections committee, and they have to approve any loans. So that also happens for any loan that we make. And there's other things as well that have to be taken into consideration. Conservators have to weigh in the stability of a piece, the fragility, the state of conservation. Can it travel, across the Atlantic? Things like that. So yeah, I mean, those are the kind of considerations I would say.
And I suppose also financially, I mean, you spoke at the beginning about the astronomical insurance values of the Van Goghs, so that has to play
Yeah,
a part as well.
yeah, yeah. I would say, pretty much, most of these shows I've done, we've got indemnity, from the U.S. government, and that's been important because that essentially, waives the insurance we have to pay on these works, because otherwise, the insurance values would be, really astronomical. So it's
Right.
important for these shows um, to get indemnity. Um,
Yeah. Okay, so next, a longer question. In making the connection between Van Gogh and Millet and Joan Mitchell and Monet, you espoused an intergenerationally comparative progression into expressionism or abstraction from realism and impressionism. This has often been a requirement for contemporary work to be art in the historical periods of organized art movements. In the art of the 21st century, we often see new work that has almost no references to past artists. So, as a curator, what advice do you have for contemporary artists in the postmodern age, trying to claim a sort of pedigree or justification in the academic world? Should artists today seek to appropriate and situate their work to help the curator, or do you think that it's up to curators to subjectively make their own connections? What advice do you have for contemporary artists or curators?
um, what advice do I have? I mean, I think for me, actually, some of the more interesting contemporary artists do engage quite self-consciously in a dialogue with the art of the past. Those tend to be probably the artists who I find the more interesting, and often those artists who are bringing sort of fresh perspectives, coming from indigenous Native American, or an artist like Kerry James Marshall coming from an African American perspective and connecting to what are often kind of dominant white modernist narratives, but complicating them those in a really interesting way. So I do, maybe in some ways because of my own background, I do, and I've seen this with Blas as well. The show I'm doing at the moment, Blas is dialoguing in a really interesting way with earlier indigenous, Peruvian art, Inca and Moche art, for example. So I personally, I actually like it when artists do show some kind of knowledge of art history and precedents and dialogue with that tradition, in an interesting and provocative way. And then, in terms of curators, yeah, I mean, curators you can try to find, the artist's original intention, and I mean, I do interviews with my artists, yeah, well, not my artist, but the artists that I do shows with. We have interviews, and we have a brochure, and so trying to get the artist's voice heard as much as possible. But I think it's important that, the curator can be a sort of artist in their own right, so that they bring their own kind of imagination and different perspectives, sort of postmodern idea of, um, so kind of new readings that maybe the artist didn't originally intend are also important. So that's what I would say. Having said that, I mean, I think, I mean, if an artist is not dialoguing with the art of the past, it doesn't mean the work isn't interesting. I think, it can still be interesting. I think, what's happening it's always interesting to me seeing how different technologies develop, and just going back to the 19th century with the emergence of photography and how artists responded to that, painters responded to that, emphasizing the sort of difference of the paint medium. But now seeing, AI, and how, I was more recently and seeing this amazing kind of installation that Refik Anadol had done, and how that's becoming such an important language within contemporary art, but also thinking about how other artists working in other media respond to that. I think it's going to be kind of interesting going forward.
Mm, mm. Um, right. So next question. Did Mitchell get pushback from galleries or other artists of her time for closely following who would have been considered old masters?
Well, no, actually, at the beginning, the gallerists encouraged it because, um, because it actually helped her market prices, in the 50s and 60s because Monet at that time, that kind of commercial connection, the fact that her work could be seen within a profitable dialogue with Monet was actually seen as something that was adding commercial value to her work. So no, initially there wasn't really pushback, but the pushback came more from Mitchell herself. So in the late 60s, early 1970s, where Mitchell is really starting to make a reputation for herself, a lot of critics are comparing her to Monet, and she starts to get fed up with it, kind of understandably. So yeah, she and then in interviews she starts to sort of push against it, and that sort of culminates. And there's an interview she gave to the New York Times where she actually talks about Monet. She actually self-consciously misstates his name. She calls him Monet, which she knew it wasn't that, but yeah, so she was the one who pushed against that and really started to want to emphasize her difference. And then she started to talk about other artists more, and her dialogue with Cézanne and Van Gogh has been more important to her than that of Monet. But I do think that the Monet connection, actually, if you look at the work, is actually stronger than some of these other artists that she was looking at.
Mm-hmm. Next is actually someone suggesting a show for you. I wonder if you might develop a show with David Hockney's works, thinking of how he has carried the landscape all through his practice. And if you did, how might you bring an American artist to bounce off Hockney's work?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I do know Hockney's work. He's obviously growing up in the UK, his work was kind of pretty familiar to me. But also he's interesting because, like, there's obviously the connection to France and the fact that he lives in Normandy. And yeah, I was just in France actually going to Cassat's place. Mary Cassat, American artist, lived in France for most of her life, also lived to the north of Paris. So a number of these artists, like Hockney, lives pretty close by, could kind of connect. So yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe I should do that. I don't know. I'm not sure. And I also like the way that Hockney, what is he in his 80s now, but he's continued to think about different technologies. And I mean, I'm working on iPads. It's hardly new now, but he's been doing that for several years and trying to keep open to different kind of platforms, I would say.
Yeah, he's got a new show, a
That.
big show of iPad works. So
Say that again, Steven?
he's got a new show up now of just a very long piece. I think it's something like 30 feet long, which is an iPad drawing. Yeah, so yeah, he's very interested in new technologies. And the book that he did with Lawrence Weschler also talks about that. Anyway, last, I
I
noticed,
don't know which. I have to think about that. There's a question of who he would dialogue with. Um,
yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to think about that one before I just say somebody. So, thank
Well,
you for the question.
we'll
I
look for
appreciate
that show.
it. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Last, I notice you aren't afraid of the neutral white wall to show work. How do you decide on wall color? Is it to give mood to the paintings?
Yeah, it is. I think watercolors I mean, the decision to make those, that is that's a conversation with the designer here. Our director also has opinions, our deputy director, so it is a group decision. But I would say, you can see there is a kind of, a number of my shows have had similar kind of organic colors connection to the sort of land theme, I would say. I don't know, for the one on the screen, I mean, it was important to me in this show to really emphasize the kind of contemporary quality to Matisse's work. So having the white walls kind of helped with that. So that's something also to think about. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to look to an artist like Matisse as a kind of forward-looking artist? I mean, he has this kind of sort of Janus-headed figure looking forward and back. But this kind of wall color does tend to emphasize him as being an artist who still very much kind of resonates today. So yeah, it's and even just in terms of the kind of layouts we've done. I mean, I used to do. It's kind of been interesting to see how this has developed over the years. You know, when I first came to the museum, we always have physical models of the galleries of the space, and even I did an Ellsworth Kelly show a couple of years ago, which Emmy Pulitzer was, part helped me with that. She was part of that. She's also in St. Louis, and she's very connected to Ellsworth Kelly, and Jack Shear also. And we did a physical model for that one, but generally we don't so much anymore. It's more, and we have sort of digital models. So yesterday I actually just did a kind of digital walkthrough for the Women Impressionists and the Land Show. So there's been a kind of progression to how we kind of develop the shows from the physical to the digital, I would say.
Right. Okay. So that's the last question. Simon, thanks so much for the presentation, and thanks to the audience. And I will see you, Simon, on the other link for the student session.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.